The band Slint only ever released 2 albums, including 1991's Spiderland. It had lots of unconventional rhythms, discursive song structures, and a generally gloomy atmosphere, and it became very influential in the developing subgenres of post-rock and math rock. However, many aspects of contemporary post-rock and math rock have since diverged from Slint's original sound, especially the band's approach to harmony, which I feel to be rather underappreciated. On the song Breadcrumb Trail, they use this distinctive sense of harmony, alongside a very deliberate arrangement, to mirror the narrative shape of the song's lyrics, resulting in an intense and evocative musical journey. Let's take a listen. The song starts with a repeated guitar riff in 7/4, combined with a simple bass melody. The chords here are essentially D major and C major add 9. As the song continues, it becomes clear that D is the tonic, which would put us in the setting of the D mixolydian mode, where these two chords have 1 major and flat 7 major functions. However, it's not unreasonable to initially hear them as the 5 major and 4 major functions in the equivalent key of G major. The most conventional use of the 4 and 5 major chords is to set up a resolution to the 1 major chord. But here, these chords simply cycle back and forth, creating a sense of continuous expectation. This type of progression is not uncommon in rock music. Usually, it has a bright, exciting sound that reflects the desire of these two chords to return to the major tonic, even if they never actually do. But in Breadcrumb Trail, the impression of these chords is much less decisive, in large part due to their voicing. You might have noticed that the bass largely avoids these chords' root notes. Really, it's more accurate to describe this chord sequence as D major over A, C major over D, and then C add 9. These first two chords have some fairly unnatural voicings. Even though a D major triad contains an A, in many styles it would be considered a mistake for the bass to really hang out on the fifth like this. This note's harmonics are essentially the notes of an A dominant 9 chord, most of which are color tones relative to D major. This makes the D major over A feel unstable, like either the triad or the bass note wants to move somewhere else. But just as the bass note moves up to a more comfortable D, the chord changes to a C major. This C major over D has a similar kind of instability, especially considering that the D isn't even found in a C major triad. In other rock songs that use slash chords like this, their sense of instability is often used to create contrast with or motion towards more stable consonant chords. But this song's opening riff never really moves away from this type of voicing. As a result, the exciting sound of the 4 and 5 major functions is given a moody twist. No longer a feeling of motivation or desire, but rather a feeling of restlessness or even boredom. Keep in mind that this isn't a dark, torturous feeling or anything. The chord qualities here are still major. But there's a distinct, if subtle, discomfort to this section's harmony. This description may seem over-specific, but it also happens to perfectly match this section's lyrics. The spoken word vocals are delivered in a very matter-of-fact style, recounting the narrator walking around an amusement park. You'd think that this place would be, well, amusing, but instead you get the sense that the narrator is kind of bored with everything. On his way to the pirate ship, he changes his mind and goes to a tent instead. He can't figure out why anyone would bother waiting in line for the sideshow, and ultimately he even balks at having his fortune read. The rhythmic aspects of this section contribute to this feeling as well. The 7/4 meter is a beat short of the default 4/4 pattern that you might expect, hastily returning to the first beat in imitation of the narrator's impulsive behavior. And as the section continues, there's also a 2-bar interlude that occasionally interrupts this rhythmic pattern. This single bar of 4/4, which the last notes of the main riff are held through, subverts the repetition of the 7/4 meter. And furthermore, as this interlude returns to the main riff, its last note is held through this main riff's first note. Even though both of these measures are in 7/4, this missing downbeat makes it much harder to hear them as rhythmically connected. This interlude also introduces a new harmonic feature. At first glance, the guitar simply arpeggiates a C major chord, but then it introduces a B flat as well. This is a non-diatonic note, borrowed into this D mixolydian setting from D minor. And in fact, there's a note sequence across this interlude: D, C, B flat, and then finally A, which is almost stereotypical of D minor. Still, the bass keeps a C underneath most of the interlude, making this more of a C-dominant 7 chord. At this stage, it's merely a subtle digression from the main riff, but it foreshadows a new harmonic direction. And after the second interlude, we move into the next section. As before, the lyrics set the scene. Instead of getting his fortune read, the narrator invites the fortune teller girl to ride a roller coaster with him. And this new section is incredibly effective at portraying the feeling of a roller coaster ride. Let's start with the rhythm. The song switches to a 12/8 time signature, with the apparent beat dilating from a quarter note to a longer dotted quarter note. The tempo subtly shifts as well, dropping from 102 beats per minute to 87 beats per minute in the second measure as the full instrumentation joins in. Now, it may seem weird to portray roller coasters, which are notoriously fast-moving, with slower tempos, but a fast tempo does not usually portray absolute speed so much as quickness or agility. A big, heavy roller coaster isn't quick. It lurches and rolls in what sometimes even feels like slow motion. You can practically feel that slow but inevitable drop from the first huge hill as the guitar cycles through these new chords, bottoming out at top speed on this final triumphant D major chord. This brings us to the harmonies, which further magnify this impression. There's a basic cycle through D sus2, D sus4, E flat major 7, A flat major 7 sharp 11, and D major at 9. The first two chords are compatible with our original key, though they remove the Mixolydian mode's characteristic major third interval. This heralds a move towards more minor features, and not just minor, but skipping past that to the Phrygian mode with an additional flat, the E flat major 7's root note, which is a minor second in the key of D. Now, borrowing darker, flattened features into a major key is not unusual in rock music, but the Phrygian mode is usually the limit of this kind of borrowing. So the subsequent A flat major sharp 11 chord is fairly jarring, borrowing from the even darker Locrian mode, which adds yet another flat. This A flat is a flat fifth relative to D, and so it's not often that you see this mode used at all, even as a source of borrowed chords. And we know that this A flat is indeed a flat fifth, and not actually the sharp fourth, G sharp, because this chord already contains a G natural. This fairly quick addition of extreme flattened features causes a precipitous, almost frightening impression, much like the drop of a roller coaster. But a drop is often followed by a straightaway, where fear gives way to exhilaration, and that's exactly what the following D at 9 feels like. It abruptly shifts back into the bright Mixolydian mode, with both the major third and major second on display. Together, these rhythmic and harmonic features are expressive enough, but the intense delivery of this section brings it one step further. The drums crash and the guitars are soaked in distortion, especially some piercing natural harmonics that are played on the upper guitar. And finally, as the section continues, we get a new vocal part, which abandons its previous spoken word style in favor of a high-pitched wail. These variations elaborate on this section's imitative qualities. For instance, the meter begins to switch back and forth between 15/8 and 12/8, and the extra dotted eighth note beat in these 15/8 measures further amplifies the gargantuan scale of the roller coaster's motion, much as described by this section's lyrics. These longer measures also give space for another chord, and indeed the progression here interpolates an F major 7 after the first D sus2. This makes the transition from the bright Mixolydian mode to the dark Phrygian mode slightly more gradual, as the F natural can be borrowed from the Dorian mode, which is only modestly darker. Eventually, after alternating between these variations a few times, this section breaks into an interlude, though this one is more distinctive than the interlude in the first section. It features some chromatic-sounding chords and another unusual rhythmic scheme. Rapidly changing time signatures are a common feature of math rock, and the modern use of this technique is often a way to cram a lot of rhythmic complexity into a single section. In contrast, the changing time signatures here are not so much complex as they are unpredictable. In essence, a brief 4/4 riff alternates with a held chord that lasts for either a 7/8 measure or an 11/8 measure. This held chord is also omitted in the fourth repetition, which leads back into the main section. The interlude's harmony is just as disconcerting as its rhythm. The first F dominant 7 is quite dark, taking its E flat and root note F natural from the D Phrygian mode. These make a chromatic movement upward into the next chord, restoring the original keys E natural and F sharp, but this chord is less well defined, with the F sharp in the bass perhaps suggesting an F sharp half diminished chord. From here, the bass returns to the E flat, suggesting a full diminished seventh shape that doesn't adhere to a single diatonic scale. And finally, this riff lands on what you might call a C major 7 over B. It's technically diatonic to the D Mixolydian mode, but it has an atypical slash chord voicing which comes across as somewhat sinister. The final repetition even alters this to a C major sharp 9 over B, a chord replete with dissonant major 7th and minor 9th intervals, and whose non-diatonic upper note seems almost totally random. Unlike the main section, these chromatic alterations don't really have an organized pattern, so their overall impression is even more angular and discordant. The meaning of this impression takes shape in some spoken word lyrics, which sketch out a vignette of the roller coaster's ticket taker, who the narrator describes as your stereotypical sleazy carnival worker. He is first seen from the vantage point of the roller coaster itself, but the second interlude describes an interaction the narrator and the fortune teller girl have with him as they get off the ride. While the girl vomits from motion sickness, the ticket taker makes a creepy, enigmatic comment. Who told you that you could leave? It seems to me that the thrilling roller coaster ride, which at least alleviates the narrator's aimlessness, also throws into sharp relief the sordid qualities of life on the ground, just as the non-diatonic features transform from purposeful intensity in the main section to something more disorganized and dissonant in the interlude. The second interlude also extends to include a few more unpredictable time signature changes. These still alternate with 4/4 measures, but now the sequence runs through 2 measures of 7/8, a measure of 10/8, 3 measures of 6/8, and then one final measure of 11/8. Just like the harmonies, there's no obvious pattern here, and the unpredictability of this augments the interlude's menacing atmosphere. Finally, the song returns to a single 12/8 measure of the main section before transitioning to a third section. Here, the drums drop out and the guitar and bass play a fairly simple modal progression in 12/8. D is held as a root note throughout, and at first the return to D major seems to suggest a return to the D Mixolydian mode. But soon a G sharp is added, as well as a B in a shape that's almost reminiscent of an E major over D chord. It's clear that we've gone all the way to the Lydian mode with its bright sharp fourth scale degree. It's a bit unusual for a sharp fourth to appear in the bass, as it does in the third measure, which has a slight unbalancing effect. But eventually we end up on this final shape, which you might call a D sus6, a fairly neutral sounding chord, before the section repeats. Without lyrics, it's hard to say what all this might represent, but to me, the bright Lydian mode feels a lot like the washed out sensation you get a few minutes after a roller coaster ride as the adrenaline rush starts to die down. Maybe the narrator feels something similar now that he's managed to get away from the sinister ticket taker. The second repetition of this section has a noisy guitar solo thrown on top. My transcription is probably a bit inexact, but the overall thrust is clear. There's lots of chromatic notes which conflict with the underlying Lydian mode, especially E flat, which is used quite a lot here. These conflicting notes tarnish this section's bright, open sound, something which I feel encapsulates this song's vacillations between diatonic and non-diatonic modalities. After the guitar solo, there's also one final measure which lets even the rhythm guitar use the harshly non-diatonic E flat. And then, just like that, we return to the first section, with all of those cheery, if slightly restless, major features that the song began with. The lyrics here describe the narrator's farewell to the fortune teller girl. There's no burgeoning romance or anything, just a bittersweet appreciation for the day's adventure. It's kind of an oddly shy ending for a song that delves into some other intense experiences, but if anything, it better resembles real life this way. Overall, Breadcrumb Trail has a lot of unique musical features, including unsteady slash chord voicings, a selection of odd time signatures, non-diatonic elements that range from unconventional to outright dissonant, and an approach which carefully melds the feelings that these features produce with a narrative lyric structure. Despite Slint's influence on math rock, perhaps now it's clear why contemporary examples of the genre fail to really reproduce the band's original sound. This concludes my analysis of Breadcrumb Trail. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.